Huge news today. The FDA has announced that next week's advisory committee looking at the EUA of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine from 6 months to 4 years old is on hold. We're going to put it off 2 more months until we get the antibody data from the third dose. This is an astonishing series of events over the last 2 weeks and represents, I think, so many things about regulatory science that we need to talk about. So what happened? Well, as you know, and I've talked about on this channel before, the standard of the randomized control trial in the 6-month to 4-year-old age group was to show non-inferior geometric mean antibody titers to show that the kids can get at least so much antibody. And that was the primary endpoint of the study. They shot with 2 doses of a 3 microgram dose, 1/10 the adult dose, and they fell short after that study was run. It's been reported in the New York Times today that they had 60% of the target antibody levels. They're not quite where they need to be. Now, what might a drug company have done? I think under many times a drug company might have gone back to the drawing board, came back with maybe a 6 microgram dose, tried it again. But what the company's done in this case is just added on a third dose, which would make it go faster. They've added on the third dose and we're waiting for the antibody levels. Then all of a sudden, 2 weeks ago, many people on Twitter started getting the bright idea, perhaps even seeded by the White House, we don't know where this idea comes from, that we should proceed with the evidence we have now, which is not quite meeting our antibody level, but maybe there's some suggestion of different symptomatic SARS-CoV-2 cases in this trial, and take it to EUA, 2 doses now, and let's try to get the third dose later down the road. And they advertised this in the news, and it was talked about as if it was a done deal. I think I saw news coverage saying that that different locations are being told when they will get the shipment of this vaccine and how they will be able to administer it. So they were getting ready to do it. Then all of a sudden today they announce that the meeting is off, they're not putting out the packet, and we're on hold until April. Wow, I don't know what to say. I've been following regulatory science throughout my whole career for about 15 years now in biomedicine, and I have also studied the history of regulatory science. I've never seen anything quite like this. This is unprecedented. We've had a series of unprecedented things happen in this space. Number one, I think we got to go back to the beginning. Many people were worried that Donald Trump would put the heavy hand of politics on the FDA and try to push an approval, a quote-unquote October surprise. And I think I was among the people who was concerned about that might happen, and that would delegitimize the FDA. Well, it turned out that didn't happen. We didn't have the October surprise in that election year. But what you're seeing now is what many people feared. I think the heavy hand of politics playing a role in the FDA. Over the course of the last year, we have seen Marian Gruber and Phil Krause, the director and deputy director of the Vaccine Products Division, resign. They're resigning, it's widely reported, under pressure from the White House to approve a boosters one-size-fits-all policy. We now in this country boosting anyone over the age of 12. They were reluctant to pursue that strategy. They have written now a number of op-eds critical of that strategy, joined by Paul Offit, who he himself is on the Vaccine Advisory Committee. And I think the question here is an important question. It isn't, do boosters benefit older people? I think the answer to that is clear. They do. They do benefit older people. I think the question is, do boosters benefit younger people? And I think it's a very different question. And even though we keep seeing more and more data, I have not yet seen persuasive data that a young, healthy person between the ages of 12 and let's say 40 even, or 50 even, that by giving them the additional dose, that third dose, you have further reduced their rate of severe disease and hospitalization. I haven't seen that data. I look forward to seeing that data, but I haven't seen it to date. And I think that's what Paul Offit says, and that's what these now resigned FDA reviewers have said, and that's why they were reluctant there. The other thing they did before they left was they expanded the sample size of the 5 to 11-year-old randomized control trial. But we don't know all their thinking in that space, and they have never made it public. And so again, I encourage media outlets, you need to track these 2 people down and conduct an interview. That's still not happened to my knowledge. I've not seen any major media network track these 2 people down and ask them, what are your thoughts on these other issues? So enter this decision. I think, obviously, the administration's under a lot of pressure to make available a vaccine for pretty much everybody, especially this age group that currently doesn't have an available vaccine. And they announced 2 weeks ago that we're going to do that with the data at hand. Now, I outlined a number of concerns, which is one, the moment you start looking at non-primary endpoints, you introduce some challenges in a regulatory space. One is, it wasn't what the trial set out to look at. The second thing is, how many times did you look at the data before you're analyzing the data? Now, in clinical trials, as a general rule, you have to pre-specify when you actually look at the data and account for the number of looks on data. The more you look at the data, you have to correct for the fact that by looking many, many times, by mere chance alone, there may be deviations in the number of events in both arms, so you need to adjust for that, and there are complex statistical methods to do that. but it typically is something pre-planned and well orchestrated. I mean, this is not something that's an unknown territory. This is tried and true territory. So the moment they say we're going to look at the secondary outcome, it's unclear if they've done all that. The next thing that's unclear is what were the cases that they are detecting. It's being reported by the New York Times that there are 50 events that occur in this age group in this randomized controlled trial, and the denominator is roughly, in the 3,000 to 4,000 ballpark. 50 events, and they're saying they have a 57% reduction in SARS-CoV-2 cases in this group. But what's the confidence interval around that 57%? And when you start getting down to 50 events, it's quite possible that confidence interval is very, very large. Possible it's as low as 27 to 75%, as some statisticians have calculated, but it depends. Nobody knows exactly what the confidence interval is because this is the time to event endpoint, and you actually need the time part of it to know for sure. And so these are all kind of best back of the envelope guesses. But this is a good statistician who has posted this, and I think she's probably in the right ballpark. But that's important because the FDA had said earlier that we would only accept a 50% or more reduction for vaccines if the lower bound of the 95% confidence interval does not dip below 30%. And it's possible it dips below that here. But I've also pointed out that even thinking down this road is kind of misguided because this is all assuming that this was the primary endpoint of the study, which it is not. It is a secondary endpoint of the study. And secondary endpoints are known to be more subject to the vagaries of chance than primary endpoints, particularly when you don't pre-specify all these things. So this would insert a lot of complications into the data set. I think the next big complication is how many of the cases are going to be Delta and how many are going to be Omicron. Remember, we're dealing with Omicron now. So I think we're going to put less stock in Delta cases. And then I think the third thing will be, how durable is this? Is this a short-term reduction in SARS-CoV-2 acquisition, or is it durable? There's now a host of data from a number of different countries suggesting that vaccine effectiveness is lower for Omicron than Delta. That's known. After all, this is an ancestral mRNA sequence that's in that vaccine. So it's natural that the deviations from that sequence would maybe not be covered as great. But the other thing is that it's waning. The vaccine effectiveness is waning with time, and that's an important factor. So these are all concerns that were floating in my mind. I made a video of this before, and I actually got some feedback from some very top people who thought that those concerns were reasonable. But I was most concerned with the fact that you've lost your director, your deputy director, and it feels as if politics is now running the FDA. That was my biggest concern. And then lo and behold, today, just on the precipice of making this advisory committee hearing and the precipice of releasing the documents, they have walked it back. So we're going to do it again in 2 months. And some people online say, well, it's better to do it right than to rush it. And this is the right call, but they're missing the forest for the trees. This is like somebody who created the problem and then are diffusing their own problem. They didn't have to go publicly and say, we're going to push this through. They did that 2 weeks ago, and now they're walking it back. It's a political fiasco. It's a total fiasco. I don't even know how much I can state how bad this is. You do not want to be playing flip-flop games with the public around vaccination. More is at stake than just this vaccine. All confidence in all vaccines are at stake. That's part of what's going on right now. We are living in a very important time where the fate of future vaccination campaign is being dictated by the choices we're making right now. I don't want to live in a world where people lack confidence in routine childhood immunization. I believe that that is a huge good, and many of the programs that have promoted that are a huge good. And I worry that the backlash to these FDA fiasco decisions is going to affect the things that have been done and tried and true for many, many decades. And that's not some theoretical worry. That's a real practical worry. We already see legislation in some states trying to peel back routine immunization requirements, and that's not something that I would support. I think the problem is you've lost people with experience. And I don't know who's making the call within the administration, but I suspect it's somebody who lacks experience. And they lack experience with regulatory matters, with evidence, with these kinds of questions. The other thing is they don't care as much about long-term reputation. They don't have the incentive in a transient administration to care about the reputation of the FDA itself over the long haul. But the reputation of the FDA itself over the long haul is the greatest thing the FDA has going for it. That's the entire thrust and strength of the FDA is their reputation. And if you don't believe me, you can read the book by Dan Carpenter. I think it's called Reputation and Precedent at the FDA. It's a nice 700-page tome, but it is a brilliant account of what made the FDA the greatest agency. Now, I think, as somebody who studies cancer drug policy, that in recent years and decades that they have largely lost a lot of that prestige. But these decisions in the vaccine space are hugely influential. They're going to be seen by so many people, and they can throw away more reputation in a short period of time than they can ever earn back. It will take decades to rebuild trust after these kinds of decisions. This is not a good call. It's not good to see the light at the 11th hour. You didn't have to go out there publicly and say you were going to do this. That was your opportunity to make the right call. I don't know what to say. Everything I know about this 6-month to 4-year-old decision, I am learning from leaked information on the Sunday talk shows, from the New York Times. I don't see the data. This is unacceptable that you have scientists clinging to bits of information we hear in the grapevine or we see in a news story to make a decision or to think about this question. They have an obligation to put this information first. This is not how the FDA works. The FDA doesn't make decisions by trickling out and leaking to reporters. I think it's 50 events. I think the denominator is this. I think it's 57. That's not how the FDA works. They carefully, meticulously look at the data, have pre-specified rules for what will count for approval, and then make the call. That's all being violated in this case. Ironically, the thing people feared that Donald Trump would do is actually happening right now. It's the heavy hand of politics influencing FDA decisions. People are playing with the FDA's credibility. It's not their money to play with. They're playing with it like it's monopoly money. It's not going to go well. I worry we're going to enter a situation where we have both made some bad calls. We are boosting people who we don't have good evidence to boost, and it may not be the right call to boost them. We may be making choices around kids' vaccines that are not consistent with European nations and may not always be in someone's best interest, particularly a healthy kid who's already had and recovered from COVID-19. And we're not doing the things we ought to be doing, like making sure everyone over the age of 65 is boosted. That's one. Two, for the people who are older, who don't have documented natural immunity, at least one dose would be much better for them than to walk around with no doses at all. Have some vaccine coverage, even one dose. So that would mean acknowledging natural immunity and making some sort of compromise with people, I think. And that would also be much, much better. But focusing so much on the youth, on young people for vaccine with this kind of age gradient just doesn't make a lot of sense. And playing with the credibility and reputation of the FDA makes no sense at all. This is bad times. I worry that we're going to end up in a terrible situation where there is widespread loss of trust in the FDA. There's going to be a backlash that affects really legitimate programs. I don't want any of this. I don't want to see loss of confidence in vaccine programs. I don't want Paul Offit to disagree with mandates. I think that when you lose Paul Offit, you've lost a lot. The man makes vaccines. He's been a crusader for vaccines, and you lost him. That should give you some pause. I don't want politics to set FDA policy. It should not be. After this is done, we need some firewalls between the White House and the FDA. And ironically, it wasn't Trump that led to that. It was this administration, which is exactly the opposite of, I think, what many of us feared. This is bad. This is just terrible. Them walking it back, the flip-flops, the public messaging around this, even the booster fiasco before, where the advisory committee said no, even though the president himself had promised it. This is just terrible for the public faith in the FDA and for the faith in vaccination. I don't know what to say. There should be culpability for this. I think people should demand some accountability for this. Who made this call? And that person's got to go. I think that's a clear standard. But we don't know who makes this call. That's part of the problem. I have proposed, a bit tongue-in-cheek, but I sincerely believe it, that I believe this administration should issue an apology to Gruber and Krauss. Apologize to these two people. They were in the right. Next, you need to rehire them, maybe as a temporary employee, but you need to make it worth their while to rehire them. You need to make a public promise that you're going to let them make all the calls. It's up to them. They can decide what the sample size of the study is. They can decide the endpoints. They can push on the companies, whatever they want. And you will not touch this issue again. You need the administration to promise not to touch this issue again. They have to get out of the FDA and get out of the vaccine business. This is going to end poorly. There will be no winners here. There's only going to be losers. I think I have never seen anything like this. I think if you had consulted people who have followed the FDA for a long time, you wouldn't have ended up in this fiasco. And I think if the institution suffers loss of trust, we will have lost so much. So I really disagree. And then the last thing I'll say is, there's some Twitter accounts who purportedly are experts. They all say the same thing, as if they are in cahoots, as if they're synchronizing their messaging. I think that's problematic. We need independent experts to be independent, to make up their own mind. And so I wouldn't go on Twitter and say the FDA made the right call. That's a false narrative. The right narrative is, what the hell did you do 2 weeks ago when you advertised this, and who made that decision, and why? And this reversal is a huge error and a blunder, and someone needs to be fired as a result of that. That's what I would say. And similarly, you don't need the president to go on TV and say when boosters are ready for all. You need the U.S. Food and Drug Administration to say when their efficacy and safety standards are sufficiently met. And I think we have a big problem. So I encourage reporters to interview these two people and to FOIA documents, because I think you need to FOIA some emails and see what's going on over here. And I think this was a colossal blunder, a huge blunder. And I think when Dan Carpenter writes his sequel to the history of the FDA, I suspect he'll write a 100-page chapter on this episode. And I worry that we may have already done the damage. So those are my thoughts on this new FDA decision. As someone who has written a few papers, you can go pull up my PubMed and all the papers I've written about FDA drug policy, drug regulation, law, etc. So this is what you get on this channel. And also, I was kind of annoyed, so I must admit, a little more annoyed than usual because this is such a fiasco. What are they doing? God, what are they doing? So if you like this, like, subscribe, comment, leave a message below. I don't think it's controversial to say we want regulators to be separate from politicians. Nobody wants a politician to be deciding what things should be approved or not. That's why this is a separate agency. They need to get out of this business. They need to stop entirely, make a promise. I think reporters should ask them to promise not to interfere with the FDA's actions ever again. Well, I don't know what to say. I'm saddened to see this. Until next time.